you can't have security without an obligation to comply. The compliance component ensures you actually implement what you say you're going to do from a security perspective.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here as usual with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's show. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Suzanne Black. She is a senior security consultant at Network and Security Technologies. Our topic is the NERC CIP standards. Suzanne is going to weigh in on the long-standing security versus compliance debate, and she's going to walk us through, what a NERC CIP audit feels like, how it works, and we're going to hit a lot of other topics that have to do with the CIP standards.
Then let's listen in to you and Suzanne.
Hello, Suzanne, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started here, can you give us a bit of an introduction? Tell us a bit about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at Network Security Technologies.
Hi, Andrew. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me today to join you. As you indicated, my name is Suzanne Black. I have been in the energy industry for over 18 years and have been involved in NERC CIP compliance since 2012. And in that time frame, I have worked for three large, major electric industry companies that spanned distribution, generation, and transmission. I have led over 20 CIP audits in multiple regions across the United States. So I have experience in just about every region that's covered under the NERC CIP standards. And I recently joined NST in April, who coincidentally also has 18 years of experience in CIP, specific requirements and helping our customers understand the requirements and untangle them and implement them. So it's a really great fit for me and for the company, and I'm very excited that I've been able to join them since April.
So thanks for that. Suzanne, our topic today is the NERC CIP standards, and we're going to be talking about compliance, we're going to be talking about security, but before we dive into those details, can you talk about the standards? What are the NERC CIP standards?
So the NERC CIP standards are specific to the electric industry, which is slightly different than what you will see with some other and more familiar security frameworks like the NIST frameworks or the ISO frameworks, where they tend to be more general and cross multiple industries. The NERC CIP standards are specifically targeted to the electric industry, and they come out of events and security events that have occurred in the energy business. So they do tend to be more focused, performance-based, and as you indicated, they have a compliance requirement to them. So unlike something that folks may be familiar with like the NIST, where they provide guidelines and a company can look at those guidelines and the security principles and determine based on their makeup or risk of their company, can implement those NIST requirements as they see fit. It's different on the NERC CIP side. There isn't that opportunity to step back and go, well, I'm only going to select certain security principles or requirements to implement. You have to implement based on a risk analysis and impact analysis of your particular facility. And once you've done that impact analysis, the standards align to and have to be applied based on that. And some of the security principles should feel very familiar, which is why this could be confusing to someone coming in from the OT side or an IT side, where you're like, oh, this seems very familiar. Access management is a great example of that. I know I need to manage access. Most cybersecurity folks, that's the first place they start, is by looking at how am I going to manage access to my systems. But how far do I go? And what's the detail? What's the requirements? How do I configure that? Well, that's usually left up to the entity and the other frameworks. And the CIP requirements, there are very specific performance-based items that you have to do. For example, in CIP 7R5, it's about system management. And it starts with talking about default accounts and identifying default accounts and keeping a listing or an inventory of those, as well as something that seems pretty common knowledge, which is you should change a default password. Very prescriptive though. It's telling you not only do you have to understand your default account, you have to inventory those and keep a listing of those. And you don't have the option to just not change a password. You have to change a password if the cyber asset is capable of doing that. And a lot of times when you look at a OT environment or, specifically a generation plant, they may be aware of doing that and that it's good security practice, but it may not have hit home of what does that mean and how specific is it. So again, an example, a specific example that I've just been through is a vendor who is implementing a system for a generator. So, well, of course we changed the default passwords, but we changed them to our default passwords, to the vendor default passwords. And my comment was, well, then that vendor default password is now common knowledge amongst multitudes of generators who have that same default password. So when that gets implemented at that specific facility, the OT security folks need to implement and change that default password to something different so that it doesn't remain as a default password. And so that's where that performance-based, getting down to the specifics, really dives into. You have to understand what the requirement's asking, and it's not a generality. It is specific. And you do have to kind of look at what that means and dig deep. Like, don't just assume that, okay, I have a default password. Well, of course, the default from the manufacturer has been changed. You have to look at, well, did you have another default password in there that maybe a vendor provided for you? So it's looking deeper into and looking at how to perform those. Then it actually connects to other SIP standards. So one of the other uniqueness to the SIP standards is they're intertwined. They have this depth and defense concept. So they layer on top of each other. Well, now that you know what your default accounts are, you need to inventory, you need to understand who has access to them, and you need to grant them access. You need to authorize them and provision them access. Well, that leads you back to SIP 4, where you have to have a process to authorize. And in that process, there are specific requirement items. So your process can be different. You can use an identity access management system to track your access for individuals and approve access. You can use a spreadsheet, but you must meet certain requirements in that process. And some of those requirements include you have to have SIP training before you give somebody access. And you have to have a personal risk assessment with very specific elements to that personal risk assessment. So again, performance-based from a security concept that takes it to that next level that some of those other frameworks don't do.
You mentioned early on a risk assessment. You talked about impact. Can you talk a little more about that assessment? Are we assessing impact? Are we assessing threat? What are we assessing here?
The impact rating process, which results in the high, medium, or low classification of a system, is very complex and multi-layered. The intention was to provide a standard for the electric industry to use, but it's not perfect because of the complexity. And for a company to get this right, it has to be a very structured process. So Andrew, let me see if I can try to break this down for you. Think of it as like a decision tree where some of the branches will continue to apply criteria and others will stop. But ultimately, we're trying to get down to those cyber systems and cyber assets that support the operation of an in-scope facility. So we start with the use of bright line criteria, a set of definitions approved by NERC, and that's complemented by internal company definitions as well to classify cyber systems within their bulk electric system facility or asset. The classification, that high, medium, low, is really a scoping mechanism to apply the SIP requirements and the security controls to that cyber system. So it's not the facility, you're applying the requirements to systems associated with the facility. Now, let me see if I can give you an example of a system that would be in scope, specific to a 1,500 megawatt generation plant. A shared DCS, one that controls all the units at a 1,500 megawatt generation plant, would be in scope to SIP after you go through this sort of decision tree process. And here's the reasons. You start with that facility that's going to be scoped in based on the SIP2 Brightline criteria, and it's scoped in as medium impact. And then you're going to look at those systems in that generation plant that make up the things that make the generator, operator, monitor, whatever is going to control that facility from a generation perspective. So you start to look at cyber systems and assets that are programmable. And that generally means that the device has to have software or firmware that can be updated. If it doesn't have updatable software and firmware, it's out of scope for SIP. So if you start to look at systems that are at your facility and it doesn't have that capability of update for software and firmware, it's out. So your decision tree stops there. But if it does and it is programmable, you're going to continue with that set of definitions. And again, the definitions are some NERC approved based and some that your company will have to complement that NERC approved definition. So one that's critical is the misuse, compromise, or degradation of a system, that if that system wasn't available to that operator at the 1,500 megawatt generation plant, would it actually have a 15-minute impact on the generator? So if it wasn't available and it was no longer existing, within 15 minutes, would it stop the operation of that generator or impact how it's being monitored or controlled? So the DCS at that 1,500 megawatt plant comes into scope to SIP, and it comes in at that medium impact level. And then again, the requirements in SIP apply at that medium impact differently than it would at a high or a low. So in a way, you can connect impact level with risk by saying, well, I have to apply more protections, more SIP requirements to a high impact system versus a medium impact or a low impact, based on sort of the risk to the overall bulk electric system if they were unavailable. And that comes down to thinking about high impact systems have 100% all of the requirements apply. A medium impact system like a DCS, you would apply 80 to 90% of the requirements. And then at a low impact facility, which you don't have to have a listing of all your systems, but you have to know you have systems that meet that low criteria, you're applying about 10 to 15% of the SIP requirements or the cybersecurity controls.
Okay, and there's a 15-minute component as well. I mean, I've looked through the standard. I confess I don't understand it. It is complicated. Can you talk about the 15 minutes? Is every computer in the building, like the one that the manager uses to read his email, is every computer in the building in scope?
So again, looking at this like a decision tree, and one of the components is that 15-minute impact criteria. It's a significant decision point when you're determining impact rating. It places a time horizon on how quickly a system that becomes unavailable on that impact of the operations of the facility, what impact does it have? It's a time horizon. It's also context for ruling out other systems like business systems that aren't used to directly or indirectly support the grid operation. So again, if you take that 1,500 megawatt plant example, things that were typically not considered SIP systems, which wouldn't have an impact on that generator operating, would be things like corporate email, corporate desktops and laptops, financial systems, marketing components. That they're not operating, or operators aren't using that information that comes across in those systems to actually control or monitor that generator or the units that comprise the generator. They're using things like the operator workstations, the SCADA, DCS. They're looking at protection systems, breakers, relays, fuel handling. Those are the ones that come in scope. So your business systems for those day-to-day business transactions, they're not in scope to SIP. You should consider them because if they have a connection to some other system, maybe via a network, they're something that you should think about. But usually they get scoped out because they're not there to run the units at a particular generator station or run the transmission facilities or the control centers. They're there from a business perspective, not in the operation of a bulk electric system.
So Nate, let me try and summarize here. Suzanne covered a lot of ground. You remember Eric Cosmond, an episode ago, we were talking about the 62443 standards. He said one of the things that's in progress in the new version of the standards is to redefine security levels, because previously they had a lot to do with threat and not enough to do with consequence. It sounds like these impact ratings in NERC CIP are all about consequence, because I never heard Suzanne use the word threat once in her explanation. So my understanding is that there are facilities that are in scope because it's a big generator, because it's a high voltage substation. There's computers that are in scope because they control those physical assets that are in scope. And the computers are in scope when they can affect, or badly affect the performance of the physical assets within 15 minutes. So, the computer that the manager of a power plant uses to read email is not something that can affect the operation of the generator in 15 minutes. Whereas if a bad guy gets in and takes over the operator HMI and presses the button to turn off the coal feed to the furnace and presses the button to hit the emergency escape valve on all of the steam from the boiler so that nothing is getting sent to the turbine, the generator is heavy. It's got enough inertia to keep generating for about 3 or 4 or 10 seconds. And then it's all over. Everything is stopped. So that HMI would be in scope if the generator was large enough. If the generator was, feeding enough of its power into a single chunk of the grid, and all of the sort of supporting systems would be in scope as well. The 3 levels in SIP are low, medium, and high, and you've got more rules, security rules, to follow on the high end than you do on the low end. We've been talking about the SIP standards here. Can we talk a little bit about where they come from? Why, where did these come from? These standards come from? Who decides? What are the rules?
That's a great question. And this is really where compliance comes into play. They come from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. Basically what FERC is the commission that looks at a variety of variables within the energy industry, including the electric industry. And they see and identify risk threats to the systems, and then they provide orders that must be enacted upon. And they do when they provide a directive, an order, they work with another agency called NERC. And NERC creates standards from that FERC order based, again, on what FERC is seeing as a potential risk or threat to the bulk electric system when it comes to SIP standards. NERC actually has a standard drafting process where they get volunteers from within the electric industry with the knowledge base of security with the electric industry, and they form as what's called a standard drafting team. That team reviews what the FERC orders were and the directives were, and they build requirements and standards based on that to hopefully meet the objective of where FERC was going. That process then, once the standard is developed, again, by volunteers in the electric industry, goes out for commenting and balloting to the rest of the electric industry. So the industry has a direct say in what the standards and requirements will look like when they become effective. And an example of where a directive might come from is Metcalfe. So for those who are unaware, there was an attack on a Metcalfe substation. This was a pretty substantial substation out in California. That attack was a physical attack. The attackers cut telecommunication lines, and then they actually tried to shoot up the transmission transformers. So they had an impact to that specific transmission substation, which is a physical attack. FERC put out a directive that they wanted that particular type of scenario addressed, and they wanted a new standard to address that particular type of attack. So they stood up, NERC received the directive as well as the industry, received the directive. They stood up a standard drafting team, and out of that came CIP 14, which is physical security specific to transmission substations that have a significant impact on the bulk electric system. So that's how sometimes these standards and directives can be developed.
Did you know that power plants are exempt from 1/4 of NERC CIP requirements when those plants use Waterfall's unidirectional security gateways? NERC CIP does not demand that power plants use the gateways, but the regulations recognize the strength of unidirectional protections. The regulations reward sites who use gateways by dramatically reducing the number of security rules for those plants. For details on the exemptions, please download Waterfall's latest report on the NERC CIP standards. You can find the report on the waterfall-security.com website in the Resources tab under eBooks and White Papers.
So Nate, let me give just a little context here. NERC and FERC are not just about cybersecurity. They regulate a lot of stuff. A lot of what they regulate has to do with safety. Stuff like, for high voltage power lines, how far away from these lines do you have to keep the trees and other vegetation so that, this stuff doesn't short out these high voltage lines. And the rules that FERC and NERC are dealing with, they apply to some really complicated stuff. Stuff like how to synchronize different transmission utilities so they don't goof up and wind up with gigawatts of power running in circles through these systems and, getting wasted heating up the wires instead of doing useful work. So, what this means is that Congress created FERC. Congress said, I'm not sure it makes sense to have political appointees. Congress appoints the FERC directors. I'm not sure it makes political appointees, it makes sense to have them creating the rules for this really complicated artifact that is the North American power grid. And so FERC delegates the job of writing the actual standards to NERC. And then to Suzanne's point, it's not NERC that creates the standards either. NERC calls on the power utilities themselves, calls on the utilities to volunteer their people, to volunteer their experts to this task. So FERC is in charge of making sure that the society's needs are met. FERC decides what kind of rules it makes sense to create. NERC enforces the rules, but it's the power utilities themselves who create the rules. Our topic is compliance, in a sense, versus security. People have accused the NERC CIP standards of being compliance focused. What's the difference? People say, well, security is doing whatever is needed, whatever you believe is needed to protect yourself against the threats out there. Whereas compliance is doing whatever somebody else has told you, whether it's useful or not. So, people tend to use the word compliance, almost pejoratively. What's the real scoop here? What's going on with security and compliance in NERC CIP?
The standards and requirements are based on security principles. They all have elements of security in them, but you can't have security without an obligation to comply. The compliance component ensures you actually implement what you say you're going to do from a security perspective. So although it can be frustrating and misunderstood in the CIP compliance world, it's really a critical element to ensure that whatever security posture, whether it be NERC CIP standards or a different set of security standards, that you actually comply and implement the security protections you're trying to perform. Without that, you will not be secure. An example of that would be when we come into, and we've seen this multiple times, entities will have a security patch program. And we'll look at the program, and they've implemented systems to actually doing patching. And then we'll dive deeper to see when they've patched or how often they're patching. And it will turn out that all good intentions, they've built a security program around patching. They've intended to do it, but they may not actually be implementing it because other priorities come in play, and sometimes those security priorities fall. So the compliance component is critical to actually ensuring that a company does implement the security principle. That what are you actually trying to accomplish?
So Nate, I was talking to Suzanne for a while as part of the recording process. I liked actually a different example she gave earlier. She pointed out, look, even if, imagine that every power company in the grid makes up their own security rules. There is no NERC CIP. Even if they did that, a large company's got 10,000 employees. Even if that company made up their own security rules, they would still need a compliance regime. They would still need internal audits. They would still need a mechanism to make sure that their 10,000 employees are applying cybersecurity the way they've defined it. So, I think the point here is that Suzanne is making is that compliance is intrinsically part of security. You don't have security unless you've got a way to check that you're actually doing what you've decided you need to do. Can you help me out here? I've never been part of a NERC CIP audit. I've heard about them from the outside. People tell me about them, but I've never actually, been involved in one. What's an audit like? What do auditors do when they show up at a site?
Let's first start with who's going to perform the audit. NERC actually performs the audit through their regional entities. They will have NERC CIP auditors either come on site and review your program, your evidence, and the activities you're doing. They'll actually interview your subject matter experts. They'll walk down your facilities. They'll look at your systems. They'll actually ask you to log into the systems and prove that you've done the configurations the way you've said you've done them. In fact, on the network side, they'll actually ask for your network configurations before they even come on site. And they'll run that through a program to determine if you've actually met the standards and requirements. And then they'll be prepared to ask questions about that when they come on site. The other side of it is you can have an off-site audit. You still have to produce evidence. You're just doing it in an off-site way. So you have to talk about how you've implemented your program. You have to produce evidence files and information to prove that you actually implemented the requirements as they've stated and as you've stated as a company. And they could actually have interviews offsite as well. So they may schedule conference calls or ask more questions. And there could be a series of data requests in both scenarios, whether it be on-site or off-site. An example of an on-site activity is the NERC CIP auditors will typically walk down your physical security protections. So they'll come in and they'll look at your facility, they'll look at what you've stated in your program and any systems you've implemented to physically protect your systems. And then they will walk down that facility. They'll enter doors, they'll cause alerts and alarms to trigger. They'll watch to see if who you've said are going to respond to those alerts and alarms do respond. And then they'll actually ask for the logs. So all of those are requirements, and they'll ask you to produce that information so that they can determine if you have indeed implemented not only the requirements, but implemented them the way you said you would implement them. On an offsite, it's very similar. Again, as you're producing evidence, they're going to look at that evidence and they're going to make sure that, okay, you've said you're going to implement this requirement in this fashion. Maybe it's a written log. Maybe you have individuals write who's entering or exiting a particular physical security area. They're going to ask to see, show me those logs. And the requirements are, show me the logs for 90 days, the past 90 days. And you'll have to produce that you actually have those logs.
So you personally have experience of, helping organizations prepare for and get through CIP audits. And, Network Security Technologies obviously corporately has a lot of experience doing this. Can you speak to your experience when people prepare for an audit, when, an organization, let's say, has just come into scope for NERC CIP and is preparing for their first audit? What are the usual stumbling points? What should people be paying attention to?
So, Andrew, what we typically see, the biggest stumbling point for an audit when we come in and we try to help an entity prepare, we see a couple of areas that need to be addressed. And the first is evidence, documentation. So these audits can happen anywhere between a 3 and 6 year period, depending on your registration. And that means you have to be able to produce evidence to show for the requirements that you've actually implemented what you said you were going to do. And that is a lot of documentation. So entities tend to stumble over having a way to organize that information, to produce it in a meaningful way for the auditors to see, to explain that information. So you can't just hand an evidence file or documents to an auditor and really expect them to understand your processes. You have to describe what that evidence is. So that tends to be one stumbling block. Another is there's going to most likely be some type of interview process with your subject matter experts. And that can be very uncomfortable. Many of these individuals who are implementing the requirements are not necessarily used to being called into an interview to describe what they're doing. And that they're keeping in mind that not only they describe what they're doing, but it represents the processes that they've written down and the evidence that they're producing for an auditor. So we do spend a lot of time working with our companies that come to us to help them with audit, to help understand what an interview process feels like. It's uncomfortable. How do you get through that uncomfortable space? What are the objectives of the auditors? What are they trying to get to? And ultimately, the auditors are there to make sure you're doing what you say you're going to do and that you're meeting the requirements. And the third stumbling block, which is a bit unusual, is understanding how your regional entity needs to receive the information. And this is a bit unique. You have to use the templates and tool sets that NERC puts out there to actually respond to the questions in the audits. And recently, NERC has instituted an evidence request tool. And that tool requires an entity to complete a multitude of tabs in a very specific prescriptive way. And if an entity or company has not retained the information in that way, it's going to be really difficult, time-consuming, and stressful for the resources to actually go through and process that information in the right format. So we typically see those three areas as being the biggest challenges with audits. And what we like to do is we like to get in with the company before they even get an audit notification, when they're building their program, to help them incorporate these components into their program so they're well ahead of a game before they get an audit. So if you can organize your information, maybe bring on a documentation management tool, track things differently, that's going to be a significant help. Because again, when you think about 3 to 6 years potentially of data from anywhere between maybe 10 requirements, to 180 sub-requirements. So there's a lot involved, and it's all about documentation and your subject matter experts being fluid in describing what they do to meet the requirements.
Okay, so those pain points you mentioned all seem to be audit related. is there nothing that people stumble over in the security space, in the design of their system in the first place?
So as we talk about security versus compliance, or in this case, security complemented by compliance, because compliance, as we discussed earlier, is a critical component to making sure you implement the security principles or the requirements. There are pain points within the CIP standards. One pain point is change management. Because again, it's not typical for administrators to think about maintaining baselines of their operating systems, firmware, software, or security patches. They may think about system hardening or whitelisting, but they may not be thinking about the fact that they have to understand their current environment, track changes to that environment, approve those changes, and do updates in a certain specific period of time. That's a very different concept than most administrators are used to. In the CIP change management world, you have to do all of those components. You have to establish what your environment looks like from a software application perspective. Then you have to build in testing processes to make sure that when you go to implement a change to that existing baseline, that you don't break something. And the main focus in CIP is that you're not breaking security controls. So typically when you test a system, you're testing to make sure it still operates as you thought it would. In the CIP world, you're also making sure you didn't break a security control that exists in another area. And then you have to approve those changes before you implement them. You can't just implement without getting some authorization record. And this goes back to, you need to prove out that you're meeting the requirements, and you're going to be asked for those change records when you go through an audit so that they can see that you did approve a change before you implemented it. And then finally, once you've implemented it, you have to make sure you re-baseline your systems so that you reestablish that new environment and what it looks like, so that you again are familiar with what's in your environment. And this really comes into play. It's very important when you're thinking about vulnerabilities or security patching. If you're not familiar with where you're currently operating, then you're not going to be familiar when a vulnerability or security patch is released, how it's applicable to you. For example, looking at your CIP baseline environment and keeping that up to date was a huge help for the SolarWinds recent security incident. If you have an updated environment and you understand what software and applications you're running in that environment, when something like SolarWinds hit, you're able to look at that data that you already have available to you to identify where that potential vulnerability exists, and allows you to react quicker to preventing that vulnerability from being exploited. And SolarWinds is a great example of that. I do believe that those in the electric industry that were properly tracking their CIP baselines were able to identify where SolarWinds existed in their environment and able to take action in a much faster capacity than other entities that weren't tracking that information or had to go pull that information from their systems, and maybe multiple systems. So the electric industry, because of the CIP standards and the requirement to track the software and keep that up to date in a timely fashion, that helped them to identify where that vulnerability from SolarWinds existed, and it allowed them to choose to mitigate that as quickly as they could.
So we talk a lot on the show about the value in knowing your systems. It seems like the point that Suzanne's making is that this isn't theoretical, this isn't academic. There are real-world consequences to knowing what you're dealing with whenever the next major vulnerability comes around, right?
Very much so. She gave the example of SolarWinds, but if you think about it, there tend to be a very small number, like 3, 4, 5 SolarWinds servers in even a large organization, is my dim understanding of how that technology works. maybe a better example would be programmable logic controllers or remote terminal units. These computers that are, underpowered, and they live very deep in the architecture. They're physically connected to the equipment that they're monitoring, and there's a lot of them. So, in an organization with 50 sites, each of the sites might have dozens of networks. Each of the networks might have dozens or, tens of dozens of these PLCs on them, all from different vendors. And if you look at the DHS, the CISA alerts that come out, in my recollection, like every week or two, they announce another half dozen or dozen vulnerabilities that have been found in various versions of these PLCs and these RTUs. And so if you have thousands of these devices in your business, having a central repository for these things, having this repository automatically maintained by a piece of software that just keeps track of what's out there, that would help enormously when the next wretched vulnerability announcement comes through, and you have to figure out which 8 of my 50 sites have any of these equipment, and which networks in those sites have them. So I take your point that especially in large organizations, this config management thing is something that could add an enormous amount of value. Okay, another area that I've heard confusion about is size. I mean, we've talked about criticality, that a certain facility is important to the bulk electric system, but organization size plays a factor here too. You might have a very small organization that's running a handful, 1 or 2 or 3 very important facilities, and so they're working with sort of the most stringent of the rules, but they're a small organization. You might have a very large organization that's managing, 76 distribution systems for 76 small towns. It's a very big organization, but very little of what they're doing is critical to the bulk electric system. You've got, you can mix and match this stuff. Can we talk about size? Do you follow the same approach with large versus small organizations?
So I think that's a multi-pronged approach. First, you have to go back to what we talked about, where you had that high, medium, and low impact, and what is your impact to the bulk electric system? Because the requirements are going to apply slightly different based on that impact rating. The next component is to consider your resourcing. So it's not necessarily the size per se of your facility. It's really about how many systems do you have in scope, and what capabilities do your resources have to meet the requirements. So you may actually have a smaller facility. You might see them implement more tools, because that's going to help them relieve some of that manual resource component. And they may implement the tools slightly different. So they may meet just the base requirements as opposed to going above and beyond and implementing more security protections than required by the standards. On the flip side, you may have larger entities that may choose to do a hybrid approach where they're implementing tools and more resources so that they can have more individuals involved in performing the activities. So you have to right size based on not only what requirements are applicable to you, but what your security objectives are. So if your security objective is just to meet the standard requirements and be compliant with the base, then you may choose to not implement as many sophisticated tools as an entity who decides their security posture needs to be more mature because they are managing more entities or systems that are critical to that bulk electric system. And they may implement more tools and they may have more resources to do so. A great example of that is CIP 10 baseline management, where you have to track your operating systems, your firmware versions, your software versions, your security patches. Some companies might be able to use a really sophisticated Excel spreadsheet, and other companies may choose to implement a system like Tripwire or Industrial Defender or SigmaFlow or some other type of system that's going to help them really track that better, where the tool's doing the work and then the personnel behind the scenes are evaluating what the tool and doing an analysis to what the tool is bringing back. And that's a pain point even, and we can most certainly dive into that a little bit later. But I think those are the components of understanding right sizing. The standards aren't prescriptive for how an entity needs to meet the requirement. It just tells you the elements that your program needs to include. So how an entity chooses to do that really is their choice.
Now, you mentioned SolarWinds a minute ago, and that reminds me of another point of confusion that I hear a lot about in the SIP world. I mean, SolarWinds Orion servers, they manage firewalls. They can be IT firewalls, they can be OT firewalls. When they manage OT firewalls, those servers, they often live on the IT network. Those Orion servers would open connections into the OT network to reach those firewalls. And, the general principle is bigger. We often see power utilities with their OT systems using IT infrastructure. They might be connected out to the Active Directory servers. They might be connected out to the IT antivirus servers or even the DNS servers. Now, I'm told that when this happens, a lot of the SIP rules wind up applying to the IT infrastructure. And this is why a lot of utilities choose to duplicate a bunch of their IT infrastructure for OT. Is what I've been told here accurate? Is this a thing in the SIP world?
It is absolutely how most companies will address it. They will look at those systems that if they become in scope to the SIP requirements on the IT side, they will assign them to only SIP assets only, and that they'll have a separate business system that may be doing the same thing for those non-critical infrastructure protection systems that are in scope, right? So they're not SIP systems that are in scope. That is very common practice, and it's because the SIP requirements do require performance. So you do have to implement the security measures, and you do have to prove that you're implementing that. So if you bring in your business systems to that, you can be upping the game on the security posture on your business side, which is great if some entities choose to do that. Isolation is also a concept in SIP, and it's something that's actually becoming more and more of a conversation when we start to talk about virtualization in cloud systems. Is there's the concept of making sure there's logical isolation to your networks and systems involved in protecting the grid.
So that's an important point that Suzanne just made there, Nate. I mean, I hear this question in other industries. The world is moving towards integrated IT and OT. IT-OT integration is everything. And how a lot of people interpret that is, let's use the IT infrastructure in OT. And a lot of engineering teams push back on this and say, no, that doesn't make sense. And, what Suzanne's just pointed out is that NERC CIP has weighed in on this. NERC CIP says, look, if you want to use IT infrastructure in your OT networks, that brings the IT infrastructure into scope for the NERC CIP rules. You have to manage the shared infrastructure as an OT resource, and you've got to manage it really quite aggressively. Okay, the NERC CIP rules are quite a bit more detailed, quite a bit more strenuous, just more difficult to implement than the way most people manage the security on their IT stuff. And so what Suzanne pointed out is that people don't do this. They generally have separate infrastructure for their OT and their IT stuff. They duplicate the Active Directory infrastructure, for example, so that you don't have to bring all of the Active Directory for the entire enterprise into scope for NERC CIP. But I think the lesson here is cross-industry. What NERC CIP points out is you need to manage your OT infrastructure in a refinery, in a railway switching system, in any critical infrastructure. You got to manage it much more aggressively than you tend to manage your IT infrastructure. And that's a reason for duplicate infrastructure cross-industry. NERC CIP just sort of made it very crystal clear why you see a lot of duplicate infrastructure in the OT space. But I think that lesson applies across industries. So, Suzanne, this has been great. Thank you for joining us. Before we let you go, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I think the most critical thing to take away from today is to understand that the SIP standards and requirements are based in security practices. And security is important because we have to make sure that electricity is available when needed. These are life systems. They support life, really. It's not a privilege to have electricity. It's a need. So the most important thing to take away is that security is really important. And yes, compliance is a component of it. And it can be frustrating and it can be difficult to navigate that environment and to understand the complexity of the standards and how they're regulated, how they're audited. So it's important for the company to understand what their security posture needs to be, to right size for their posture, for their resourcing, for what they can support, and to understand that there's a lot involved with not just implementation of doing something, but documenting that you're doing it. It's so critical to document and to check that documentation. If you're not checking, then you really don't know. You don't have measures in place to understand your security posture. You have to measure, am I doing what I say I'm doing? And I think that's really something that my company, NNST, has perfected. We have helped so many companies in this space to understand and get through the complication and challenges and frustrating part of the SIP standards, and we've helped make it easier for them. We've made it digestible. We can help implement tools and technologies and processes and explain the documentation that's needed. We can really help an entity understand the requirements from both that security perspective and the compliance world. And I'm happy if your listeners would like to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, or they're more than welcome to hit our website, which is nst.us. Please do so. There's contact information out there. We welcome the conversations, and we're ready and willing to help our customers.
So that was Suzanne's final word. Andrew, how about something from you?
My big takeaway here is sort of the point that Suzanne made that, look, compliance is essential to security. You don't have security unless you have compliance. It does no good defining these rules if nobody comes by and asks, have you actually done that? And, I'm not sure she said it, but in my estimation, in the bigger picture, does it make sense for every power company in North America to make up their own security rules? Probably not. It probably makes sense to have an industry-wide consensus as to what these rules should be. Well, that's NERC CIP. And it probably makes sense to have a compliance mechanism to make sure that we're all applying these rules instead of ignoring them or forgetting them or, getting out prioritized with other activities. So, my voice has kind of been one of the voices that over the years has said, this compliance thing is a real drag. Well, Suzanne's just convinced me that it's essential. It's part of security. Get used to it. And so that's my big takeaway.
All right. Well, thanks to Suzanne Black for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everyone out there listening.